When actor Jonathan Roumie walked into Judge Beatrice Thornwald's courtroom without a lawyer to defend himself against Stream Faith Media's lawsuit, she couldn't suppress the amused smile that crossed her face. In 30 years presiding over intellectual property cases in Los Angeles Superior Court, she had seen countless celebrities make foolish decisions. But this topped them all. The man who portrayed Jesus in the most successful faith-based series in history was about to represent himself in a complex copyright infringement case against one of the largest religious media companies in America. What Judge Thornwald didn't know was that behind Roumie's humble demeanor and seemingly disorganized papers lay a brilliant strategy that would expose not just corporate theft, but her own painful past, and ultimately leave everyone in the courtroom stunned by what happened next. Judge Beatrice Thornwald's gavel struck the polished wood 3 times, each crack echoing through courtroom 12 of the Los Angeles Superior Court. The sound carried weight, authority, the accumulated power of 3 decades spent interpreting law and deciding fates. "Court is now in session," she announced, her voice sharp and practiced. "Case number 2025-CV-9347. Stream Faith Media Corporation versus Jonathan Roumie." The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Entertainment reporters filled the front rows, their phones silenced but ready. Faith-based media outlets had sent their best journalists. Even mainstream networks like CNN and Entertainment Tonight had correspondents present. This wasn't just another intellectual property dispute. This was a battle between David and Goliath in an industry that generated billions annually, with a beloved actor at the center of a scandal that could destroy his reputation. Judge Thornwald surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. On the left sat Stream Faith's legal team. 5 attorneys in expensive suits clustered around their lead counsel, Margaret Chen, a woman known for her ruthless efficiency in copyright cases. Behind them sat Victoria Hammond, Stream Faith's CEO, perfectly coiffed in a designer blazer, exuding the confidence of someone who had crushed competitors for 2 decades. On the right side sat Jonathan Roumie, alone. No legal team, no assistants. Just the actor in a simple dark suit with papers stacked somewhat haphazardly on the table before him. Judge Thornwald noticed he kept a worn leather journal close at hand, the kind artists and writers carried, filled with handwritten notes that probably meant nothing in a court of law. "Mr. Roumie," Judge Thornwald began, consulting her documents. "My records indicate you're representing yourself in this matter. Is that correct?" Roumie stood, his movements unhurried. "Yes, Your Honor." A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Even the court reporter glanced up from her machine, eyebrows raised in surprise. Judge Thornwald allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She had seen this before. Wealthy people, usually men, who believed their success in one field translated to expertise in all others. They walked into her courtroom convinced their charisma or intelligence would carry them through complex legal proceedings. They were always wrong. "Mr. Roumie," she said, her tone carrying a hint of condescension she couldn't quite suppress. "I must inform you that intellectual property law is extraordinarily complex. Copyright infringement cases require extensive knowledge of precedent, statutory interpretation, and evidentiary procedure. Are you certain you wish to proceed without counsel? I appreciate your concern." "Your Honor," Roumie replied quietly. "But yes, I'm certain." Judge Thornwald sighed audibly. "Very well. Don't say I didn't warn you." She turned to the plaintiff's table. "Miss Chen, please present your opening statement." Margaret Chen rose with fluid grace, approaching the bench with a tablet in hand. "Your Honor, members of the court," she began, her voice carrying perfectly through the room. This case represents one of the most egregious examples of copyright infringement in the entertainment industry's recent history. She activated the courtroom's display system, and a crisp presentation appeared on screens throughout the room. Stream Faith Media has been developing faith-based educational content for over 15 years. 3 years ago, we created the Sacred Method, a comprehensive program for teaching actors how to portray biblical characters with authenticity and reverence. Chen clicked to the next slide, showing course materials, video thumbnails, and curriculum outlines. We invested millions in development, hired the best scriptwriters, acting coaches, and theologians. We filmed over 200 hours of instructional content. We created a detailed framework that revolutionizes how faith-based performances are taught. Judge Thornwald listened attentively, taking occasional notes. This was Chen's strength, presenting complex information with clarity and authority. The attorney continued for 20 minutes, building a methodical case about how Stream Faith had pioneered this educational approach, filed proper copyrights, and prepared to launch their program. Then, Chen's voice took on an edge of righteous anger. Mr. Roumie approached us. He requested a meeting, claimed he wanted to explore a partnership. We welcomed him, gave him a tour of our facilities, showed him our materials in good faith. And what did he do? She paused dramatically, letting the question hang in the air. He stole everything. Within months of that visit, he launched his own program called The Chosen Method. Same structure, same techniques, even similar marketing materials. He took our years of work and repackaged it as his own innovation. The final slide showed side-by-side comparisons of both programs' promotional materials. The similarities were indeed striking. Judge Thornwald found herself nodding slightly. This looked bad for Roumie. Thank you, Miss Chen, the judge said when the presentation concluded. Mr. Roumie, your opening statement. Roumie stood and approached the bench. But instead of the polished confidence Chen had displayed, he fumbled slightly with his papers. Several loose sheets slipped from his hands and fluttered to the floor. Someone in the gallery chuckled. Judge Thornwald pressed her lips together, suppressing her own amusement. Your Honor, Roumie began as he gathered the fallen papers. I'm here today because Stream Faith Media is attempting to steal work that my team and I developed over 6 years of dedication to the Chosen series. He paused, seeming to lose his train of thought as he shuffled through his notes. The battery design, the teaching method we created uses a special, He stopped, looking confused. Sorry. I have some diagrams here somewhere that explain the process better. Judge Thornwald couldn't help herself. A small laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. Mr. Roumie, she said, attempting to regain her composure. This isn't a film set. In my courtroom, we follow proper legal procedure and present organized arguments. Do you have your evidence ready? I believe so, Your Honor, Roumie replied, still searching through his papers. The gallery erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. From the plaintiff's table, Margaret Chen shot Roumie a look of undisguised satisfaction. This was going to be easier than she had anticipated. Perhaps, Judge Thornwald suggested with thinly veiled condescension, you should have reconsidered your decision to represent yourself. It's not too late to request a continuance and retain proper counsel. I'll manage. Your Honor, Roumie said, finally organizing his papers into something resembling order. Very well. The judge sighed. Miss Chen, please proceed with your case. As Stream Faith's legal team wheeled in carefully organized boxes of evidence, Judge Thornwald leaned back in her chair and caught the eye of her clerk. The clerk smiled knowingly. and the judge gave a tiny shake of her head. Another arrogant actor, about to learn a painful lesson about the difference between performing for cameras and presenting arguments in a court of law. Chen set up another sleek digital presentation. "Your Honor, if I may," she said, and began walking through a timeline of events. On March 15th of last year, Mr. Roumie contacted our CEO, Victoria Hammond, requesting a meeting. He claimed to be interested in collaborating on educational content for actors in faith-based productions. The screen showed email exchanges, all seemingly professional and friendly. Streamfaith, always eager to work with talented artists, welcomed him. We gave him a comprehensive tour of our facilities on April 2nd. Judge Thornwald watched as security footage played, showing Roumie walking through Streamfaith's offices, stopping to examine materials, asking questions. Nothing looked suspicious. But Chen's narration painted a different picture. Throughout the visit, Miss Roumie took extensive notes. He asked detailed questions about our curriculum structure, our filming techniques, our theological framework. We answered openly because we believed we were exploring a genuine partnership. The presentation continued with more evidence meeting notes, follow-up emails, and then the damning timeline. On June 1st, just 8 weeks after his visit, Mr. Roumie announced the Chosen Method Online Academy. "Compare the structure," Chen demanded, pulling up side-by-side screenshots. Judge Thornwald had to admit the similarities were striking. Both programs offered 12-module curricula. Both combined acting technique with biblical scholarship. Both used similar terminology: incarnational acting, sacred storytelling, character transformation framework. The evidence speaks for itself. Chen concluded, "This is not coincidence. This is calculated theft of intellectual property." Throughout this presentation, Judge Thornwald occasionally glanced at Roumie. He sat quietly, taking notes in his leather journal, his face giving away nothing. Once, she caught him staring at a seemingly random point on the courtroom wall, apparently lost in thought. "Mr. Roumie," she interrupted sharply, "are you paying attention to these proceedings?" Roumie blinked and focused on her. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm considering the testimony carefully." She frowned. "Well, consider it more actively. This is your reputation and livelihood at stake." "I understand, Your Honor," he replied calmly. The morning session continued with Chen calling their first witness, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, an expert in intellectual property and educational curriculum design. After being sworn in, Whitfield settled into the witness chair with academic confidence. "Dr. Whitfield," Chen began, "you've reviewed both Streamfaith's The Sacred Method and Mr. Roumie's The Chosen Method." "Correct. Yes. Extensively," Whitfield replied. "In your expert opinion, could these programs have been developed independently?" Whitfield shook his head definitively. "The similarities are too numerous and specific. Both programs use identical organizational frameworks, similar pedagogical approaches, and even parallel theological interpretations of specific biblical passages. The probability of independent development is statistically negligible." Judge Thornwald took careful notes. This was damaging testimony, delivered by a credible expert with impressive credentials. She glanced at Roumie, expecting some reaction, but he remained oddly calm, still writing in that leather journal. When Chen finished her direct examination, Judge Thornwald turned to Roumie. "Mr. Roumie, you may cross-examine the witness." Roumie stood, but instead of approaching the witness stand, he seemed to hesitate. "Actually, Your Honor, I'd like to reserve my questions for later." Judge Thornwald couldn't hide her disappointment. "That's your right," she said, but it's generally strategic to challenge expert testimony immediately. I appreciate the advice. Your Honor, Roumie replied with that same maddening calm. As the session continued, Judge Thornwald found herself growing increasingly irritated by Roumie's passive approach. When he finally did object to something, his argument was so poorly framed that she had to cut him off mid-sentence. Mr. Roumie, she said with exasperation, that's not how evidentiary procedure works. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the federal rules of evidence before tomorrow's session. The courtroom tittered again, and Judge Thornwald allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Sometimes people needed to be humbled, especially those who believed fame exempted them from the rules that governed everyone else. But as the first day concluded and she reviewed her notes and chambers, something nagged at her. Roumie's apparent incompetence seemed almost too perfect, too consistent. And that leather journal he kept writing in, what was he documenting so carefully, if not legal strategy? She dismissed the thought. 30 years of experience had taught her to recognize the signs of someone out of their depth. Jonathan Roumie was exactly what he appeared to be. An actor who had made a catastrophically poor decision and would pay the price. What Judge Beatrice Thornwald didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that the fumbling actor before her had spent the last 6 months preparing for this exact moment. That every seemingly confused pause, every dropped paper, every poorly framed objection was part of a carefully orchestrated performance. And that by the time she understood what was really happening, it would be far too late to stop what came next. 6 months earlier, the studio lot buzzed with energy as filming wrapped on Season 4 of The Chosen. Jonathan Roumie sat in his trailer, still wearing the simple robes of his character, reviewing scripts for the next day's shoot. His phone buzzed with an email that would change everything. Victoria Hammond, CEO of Streamfaith Media, wanted to schedule a meeting. The message spoke of collaboration, of combining The Chosen's storytelling success with Streamfaith's educational resources. It sounded perfect. Almost too perfect. Jonathan's assistant director, David Chen, leaned against the trailer doorway reading over his shoulder. Streamfaith, he said thoughtfully. They're big. Really big. 30 million subscribers across their platforms. Jonathan nodded slowly, his instincts already whispering warnings he couldn't yet articulate. What do they want from us that they can't create themselves? Maybe they're genuine, David suggested. Or maybe they want to absorb what you've built into their empire. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Jonathan's production office, a converted warehouse in Burbank where he and his small team had been developing something revolutionary. For 6 years, playing this role had taught him things about acting, about faith, about storytelling that no formal training had provided. He had meticulously documented every insight, every technique, every breakthrough in understanding how to portray sacred characters with authenticity rather than caricature. The result was The Chosen Method, a comprehensive teaching program that combined method acting with theological depth and spiritual preparation. It wasn't just about technique. It was about transformation, about actors learning to embody characters rather than merely perform them. Jonathan had poured countless hours into developing curriculum, filming masterclasses, creating exercises that bridged the gap between craft and calling. Victoria Hammond arrived exactly on time, bringing 2 assistants who carried tablets and designer leather portfolios. She was tall, immaculately dressed, with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. Jonathan, she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. Thank you for seeing us. I've been wanting to meet you for years. They settled in the conference room, and Victoria launched into her pitch. Streamfaith had been in the faith-based content business for 15 years. She explained. They had the infrastructure, the distribution network, the marketing expertise. What they lacked was the creative spark that made The Chosen resonate with audiences worldwide. "We want to partner with you," Victoria said, leaning forward with rehearsed sincerity. "You bring the artistic vision. We bring the reach. Together, we could train thousands of actors, create content that transforms the industry." Jonathan listened carefully, noting how her assistants kept glancing at their tablets, their fingers moving in ways that suggested they were recording or transcribing the conversation. "What exactly would this partnership entail?" he asked. "We'd love to see what you're working on," Victoria replied smoothly. "Understanding your process would help us determine how to best support your vision." Something in her tone made Jonathan's internal alarms sound louder. He thought of the months of work sitting in the next room, the carefully crafted curriculum that represented not just intellectual property, but a calling, a mission to elevate faith-based storytelling. "I can give you a general tour," Jonathan said carefully, "but some areas contain proprietary material still in development." Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, we completely understand protecting your work." The tour began innocuously enough. Jonathan showed them the editing bays where masterclass footage was being refined, the small soundstage where they filmed instructional segments, the library of theological resources he had assembled. But he noticed things. Victoria's assistant pausing to photograph a whiteboard covered with curriculum structure before Jonathan could erase it. The other assistant angling her tablet to capture documents left on a desk. Small things, easily explained away as innocent curiosity. When they reached the main production office, Jonathan stopped at the door. "This area is off limits," he said firmly. "Ongoing proprietary development." Victoria nodded with exaggerated understanding. "Absolutely. We respect that completely." But as Jonathan turned to lead them back, he caught Victoria peering through the office's side window, her eyes scanning the materials visible inside with predatory focus. The look lasted only seconds before she realized he was watching and schooled her features back into friendly professionalism. After they left, Jonathan stood motionless in the parking lot, watching their black SUV disappear down the street. David joined him, looking concerned. "That felt wrong," David said quietly. Jonathan pulled out his phone and called their head of security. "I need all footage from today's visit," he said. "Every camera, every angle, every second they were in the building." That night, Jonathan sat in his home office reviewing the security recordings. There it was, clear as day. Victoria's assistant photographing the whiteboard when Jonathan's back was turned. The other assistant zooming in on documents with her tablet camera. Victoria herself taking a photo through the office window when she thought no one was watching, capturing the curriculum outline board that Jonathan had stupidly left visible. He could have sworn he saw her lips move, reading and memorizing the framework structure he had spent years developing. The 12-module approach, the integration of theological study with acting technique, the character transformation methodology that made his program unique. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, anger and sadness warring in his chest. He had known, instinctively, that something was off. But seeing the proof, watching these people systematically steal his work while smiling to his face, ignited something deeper than anger. It ignited resolve. 2 months passed. Victoria never called about the partnership. Jonathan wasn't surprised. Then one morning, David burst into his trailer during a break in filming. "You need to see this," he said, shoving a tablet into Jonathan's hands. The screen showed Streamfaith's homepage announcing their revolutionary new program, The Sacred Method. The promotional copy spoke of combining acting excellence with spiritual depth, of training actors to embody biblical characters through a comprehensive 12-module curriculum. The structure was identical to Jonathan's. The terminology eerily familiar. Even the marketing approach mirrored his own vision. Jonathan scrolled through the announcement, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. They had taken everything. Not just the general concept, but the specific framework he had labored over. The pedagogical approach he had refined through years of trial and error. "We have to call the lawyers," David insisted. "This is theft." Jonathan made the call. 3 attorneys from the entertainment firm that handled the Chosen's contracts listened to his evidence and reviewed the materials. Their assessment was grim. It would be difficult to prove. One lawyer explained, "Ideas aren't copyrightable. Only specific expressions of those ideas. Unless you can demonstrate they had access to your materials and copied them substantially. The case is weak. But I have video of them photographing my materials," Jonathan protested, which they could claim was for reference, not copying. The lawyer countered, "And Victoria will argue their program was already in development. This will be expensive, lengthy, and uncertain." The more Jonathan talked with his legal team, the more frustrated he became. They spoke in careful qualifications, managed expectations, discussed settlement possibilities. No one seemed to grasp what this theft really meant. This wasn't just about money or market share. This was about calling, about years of prayer and development, about a mission to elevate how faith was portrayed on screen. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He paced his apartment until 3 in the morning, wrestling with a decision that seemed insane but wouldn't leave him alone. Finally, he sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He began researching intellectual property law, reading cases, studying precedents, learning the language and logic of copyright litigation. His phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was David. "Did you see Streamfaith filed a lawsuit? They're suing us for copyright infringement." Jonathan stared at his ceiling, processing this new development. "They're preemptively striking," he said quietly, "getting their narrative out first, painting us as the thieves." "What do we do?" David asked. "Get me everything we have on that visit." Jonathan replied, "Every piece of security footage, every email, every document, and find out everything you can about Victoria Hammond, her history, her previous business deals. Anything that shows a pattern." "You're going to fight this?" David sounded both relieved and worried. "I'm going to do more than fight it," Jonathan said. "I'm going to handle it myself." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. "You mean represent yourself in federal court, Jonathan? You're not a lawyer." "No." Jonathan agreed. "But I've spent 6 years studying character, motivation, truth. I've learned how to see beneath surfaces, how to find authentic emotion beneath performed facades. And I've learned something else." "What?" "Sometimes the best defense isn't what people expect. Sometimes you have to play a role they don't see coming until it's too late." Over the following weeks, Jonathan's behavior grew increasingly unusual. He canceled meetings with his legal team. He spent hours in law libraries, surrounded by casebooks and statutory volumes. His apartment became a command center. Walls covered with timelines, evidence logs, and legal briefs he was teaching himself to write. David found him one night at 2 in the morning. Still awake. Still working. "This is crazy," David said, picking up a book on copyright precedent. "You're preparing to argue complex law against attorneys who've spent decades doing this." Jonathan looked up, his eyes tired but focused. "They'll expect a legal defense, expensive lawyers, expert witnesses, the traditional approach. They won't expect me. That's because what you're planning is professional suicide," David countered. "Maybe. Jonathan acknowledged. Or maybe it's the only way to win. He turned his notebook toward David. The pages were filled with notes. But not just legal arguments. There were character studies, motivation analyses, strategic breakdowns of Victoria Hammond's likely approach. You're treating this like a role, David said slowly. Understanding dawning. It is a role, Jonathan replied. Just not the one they think I'm playing. For 6 years I've been studying how to embody truth, how to strip away pretense and show authentic reality. Now I'm going to do that in a courtroom. What if you lose? Then I lose. Jonathan said simply, but I'll lose knowing I fought for what matters. The way I believe it should be fought, not with legal maneuvering and settlement negotiations, but with truth presented so clearly that even those who want to ignore it can't look away. As the trial date approached, Jonathan made his final preparations. He had discovered something crucial in his research. An obscure provision in the Digital Content Protection Act that most attorneys had never used. Section 34C provided severe penalties for stealing educational curriculum, including a 5-year ban on developing similar content if corporate espionage could be proven. More importantly, he had learned something about Judge Beatrice Thornwald. Before her legal career, she had been a theater director in New York, and in 1985, a production company had stolen her original teaching method for training actors in classical theater. She had been too young, too poor to fight them in court. The theft had driven her to law school, determined to protect others from what she had experienced. Jonathan knew the judge wouldn't remember him researching her background. She wouldn't know he had found old articles about her case. Interviews where she spoke bitterly about losing her life's work to people who smiled while they betrayed her. But he knew, and he had built his entire courtroom strategy around that knowledge. Around speaking directly to the wound that still motivated her 3 decades later. The night before trial, David sat with him in the production office. "Are you really going to do this?" David asked. "Walk in there alone and take on their entire legal team." Jonathan looked at the evidence spread across the table. Security footage showing Victoria's theft. The timeline proving Streamfaith had no similar program before his visit. Emails he had obtained through a former Streamfaith employee who had quit in disgust. And the ace he hadn't told anyone about yet. Victoria Hammond's own notebook. Obtained legally through discovery. Containing her handwritten notes from the day after visiting his facility, saw Roumie's method today. Revolutionary approach. Must duplicate before he can scale it. Yes, Jonathan said quietly. I'm going to do this. Because this isn't just about winning a lawsuit. It's about showing that truth matters more than performance. That authenticity defeats deception. And that sometimes the greatest act of faith is trusting that doing the right thing in the right way will produce the right result. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of what tomorrow would bring. Then he opened them again, picked up his worn leather journal, and began making final notes for his performance. Not as an actor playing a role, but as a man determined to reveal truth in a place built for arguing it. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Jonathan emerged after the first day's disaster. Microphones thrust toward him. Cameras clicking in rapid succession. "Mr. Roumie, will you hire an attorney now? Are you giving up? Did Streamfaith's evidence surprise you?" He pushed through without answering. David clearing a path to their car. Once inside, David exploded. That was brutal. Hammond looked smug. Chen destroyed us with that expert testimony. And the judge? She was practically laughing at you. Jonathan stared out the window as Los Angeles traffic crawled past. Everything went exactly as planned, he said quietly. David twisted in his seat. Planned you, looked completely lost in there. Half the courtroom was laughing. Good. Jonathan replied. Let them laugh. Let Victoria think this will be easy. Let Chen believe I'm unprepared. He finally turned to look at his friend. Tomorrow changes everything. They drove to a small office Jonathan had rented across from the courthouse, converted into a temporary war room. Inside, a woman in her early 40s sat waiting, her dark hair pulled back severely, her expression nervous but determined. Sarah Martinez stood when they entered, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "Mr. Roumie," she said, "thank you for meeting me." Jonathan took her hand gently. "Thank you for coming. I know what this costs you." Sarah had worked for Stream Faith Media for 7 years, rising to become their director of content development. She had been in the meeting when Victoria returned from visiting Jonathan's facility, had witnessed firsthand what happened next. And 3 weeks ago, she had resigned rather than participate in what she knew was theft. "Tell me everything," Jonathan said as they settled around the conference table. "Start with the day Victoria visited my office." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She came back excited, almost manic. Called an emergency meeting of the senior staff that same afternoon. She had photos on her phone, dozens of them. Your curriculum outline, your module structure, your methodological framework. She projected them on the screen and said, "This is what we're building." "Did she specifically instruct you to copy my work?" Jonathan asked. Sarah nodded. Her exact words were, "I want this program recreated down to the smallest detail before Roumie can patent his approach." She assigned me to lead the project, gave me a timeline of 8 weeks. "And you objected?" "I told her it was corporate espionage," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "I said we should approach you about a legitimate partnership or develop our own distinct program." She said, and I quote, "Why pay for what we can take for free?" Jonathan felt David tense beside him. "Do you have evidence of this?" David asked. Sarah opened her laptop, turning it toward them. "I kept detailed notes from every meeting. I also saved emails and text messages where these directives were given. And there's something else." She pulled up a series of documents. 2 weeks before Victoria visited your facility, she held a strategic planning meeting. I have the minutes. Stream Faith had no educational program in development at that time. 0. Our focus was entirely on devotional content and Bible study materials. The entire concept of actor training emerged only after Victoria's visit to you. "This is exactly what we need," Jonathan said, studying the documents carefully. "Will you testify?" Sarah's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Yes. That's why I'm here. I couldn't stay at a company built on theft. My faith won't allow it." She looked directly at Jonathan. "What Victoria did, what she asked me to do, it violates everything I believe about integrity and honoring other people's work." They spent the next 3 hours going through Sarah's evidence, organizing it chronologically, building the narrative that would demolish Stream Faith's claims. Jonathan took meticulous notes in his leather journal. But Sarah noticed something unusual about his approach. "You're not just documenting facts," she observed. "You're analyzing motivations, patterns of behavior." Jonathan looked up. 6 years playing the same character teaches you to see beneath surface actions to underlying drives. Victoria's pattern is consistent. She identifies valuable innovations others have created, takes them through charm and deception, then weaponizes the legal system to protect her theft. "How do you know it's a pattern?" David asked. "Because I researched her history," Jonathan replied. He pulled up files on his laptop. In 2012, she approached an independent filmmaker named Marcus Cole who had developed a unique streaming platform for faith content. She requested meetings, gained access to his systems, then launched an identical platform 6 months later. Cole couldn't afford to fight her legally. He lost everything. Sarah's eyes widened. I never knew about that. Most people don't. Jonathan said, Victoria is careful. She targets people without resources to fight back. Or she overwhelms them with legal expenses until they surrender. He closed the laptop. But this time, she made a mistake. She targeted someone who understands performance, who knows how to control a narrative, and who isn't afraid to fight in unconventional ways. What's your strategy? Sarah asked. Because Chen is a shark. And Judge Thornwald clearly doesn't respect you. Tomorrow, I'm requesting a one-day recess. Jonathan said. David stared at him. Why would you do that? Because I want them overconfident. Victoria thinks I'm giving up, that I'm finally realizing I'm out of my depth. But what we're actually doing is giving Sarah time to prepare her testimony, making sure every piece of evidence is organized perfectly, and letting Chen and Victoria get comfortable in their assumed victory. That's incredibly risky, Sarah said. Jonathan smiled slightly. So was walking in there without a lawyer. But everything I've done has been calculated to create this moment when their guard is down and truth can hit with maximum impact. As evening fell, they continued preparing. Jonathan asked Sarah questions. Gentle but probing, helping her anticipate Chen's cross-examination. He showed her how to ground herself in truth, how to speak with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to reveal. You're coaching me like an acting director, Sarah observed. Same principles. Jonathan replied. Authentic testimony comes from the same place as authentic performance. Truth embodied rather than performed. When you testify, don't think about convincing anyone. Just tell what you witnessed, what you felt, why you couldn't participate anymore. Around midnight, David ordered food. As they ate, Sarah asked the question that had been building all evening. Why are you really doing this yourself? The self-representation strategy. There has to be more to it than just surprising them. Jonathan set down his coffee, considering how much to reveal. Judge Thornwald used to be a theater director. He said quietly, in 1985, someone stole her teaching methodology. She was too young and poor to fight them. It drove her to law school, shaped her entire career. How does that help us? David asked. Because every decision she makes in that courtroom is informed by that theft. Jonathan explained. When she looks at Victoria Hammond, she's seeing the person who stole from her 30 years ago. When she sees me fumbling with papers and looking unprepared, she's seeing herself at 25. Outmatched and overwhelmed. He paused. Tomorrow, when I present evidence showing Victoria's pattern of theft, when Sarah testifies about being asked to participate in corporate espionage, it won't just be another case for Judge Thornwald. It will be her case, finally being argued the way she wished someone had argued it for her. That's brilliant. Sarah breathed. You're not just presenting a legal defense. You're telling the judge her own story with a different ending. Jonathan nodded. The law is important. Evidence matters. But judges are human. They carry wounds and hopes like everyone else. Understanding what drives Judge Thornwald, what she needs to see proven in her courtroom. That's the key to this entire strategy. David leaned back, reassessing everything he thought he understood about Jonathan's approach. So, tomorrow, when you ask for a recess, you're not actually retreating. I'm setting the stage. Jonathan confirmed, letting them believe I'm scared, watching their confidence grow, and preparing for the moment when everything flips. They worked until 3 a.m, refining testimony, organizing evidence, preparing for every possible challenge Chen might raise. When Sarah finally left, she hugged Jonathan briefly. Thank you for giving me a chance to make this right. she said. "I've been carrying this guilt for months." After she departed, David and Jonathan sat in the quiet office, surrounded by evidence that would either vindicate them or prove insufficient. "You really think this will work?" David asked. Jonathan looked at the security footage frozen on the monitor, showing Victoria photographing his work. "I think truth has power when presented properly," he replied. "I think authentic testimony resonates differently than rehearsed corporate deflection. And I think Judge Thornwald is ready to see justice done in a way she never got for herself." "But what if Chen destroys Sarah on cross-examination?" David pressed. "What if the judge doesn't see what you want her to see?" Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they held the same focused intensity he brought to his most demanding scenes. "Then we'll know we fought with integrity, that we honored truth over strategy, and that we gave one woman a chance to stand against the system that crushed her. That has to be enough." The night before the second day of trial, Jonathan stood at the window of his temporary office, looking out at the darkened courthouse across the street. Somewhere in that building, Judge Beatrice Thornwald was probably reviewing case files, perhaps thinking about the strange actor who seemed so unprepared, yet so strangely calm. Tomorrow she would see why. Tomorrow, the fumbling performance would drop away, and she would finally understand that she hadn't been watching incompetence. She had been watching preparation of the most meticulous kind, waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal itself. Jonathan picked up Victoria Hammond's notebook, the one obtained through legal discovery, and read again the damning entry written the day after she visited his facility. The handwriting was neat, confident, completely unaware that it would eventually become evidence of her own guilt. Sometimes, he thought, the most devastating testimony comes not from witnesses, but from the accused themselves, captured in moments when they believed no one was watching and truth spilled onto the page unguarded. He closed the notebook, set it carefully in his evidence box, and went home to sleep. Tomorrow would be long. Tomorrow would be brutal. But tomorrow would also be the day when everyone in that courtroom learned that Jonathan Roumie had been playing a role from the very beginning, and the final act was about to commence. Morning arrived with unusual clarity. The Los Angeles skies scrubbed clean by overnight winds. The courthouse steps were even more crowded than the previous day, word having spread about the entertainment industry's most watched trial. Jonathan arrived early, David beside him, carrying a single briefcase that seemed inadequate for the legal battle ahead. Reporters shouted questions that went unanswered as they climbed the stone steps and passed through security. Inside courtroom 12, Streamfaith's legal team was already assembled. 5 attorneys, arranging documents with military precision. Victoria Hammond sat behind them wearing a different designer suit, her confidence evident in every gesture. She caught Jonathan's eye and smiled, the expression of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the formality of official confirmation. Judge Thornwald entered exactly at 9, and the room fell silent. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. The judge settled into her chair, surveying the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had presided over thousands of proceedings and expected nothing surprising from this one. "Good morning," she began, her tone crisp. "Mr. Roumie, I trust you've had time to reconsider your approach to this case. Would you like to address the court before we continue?" Jonathan stood slowly, and for a moment he allowed uncertainty to color his features. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a one-day continuance." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. Judge Thornwald's eyebrows rose. "On what grounds?" "Mr. Roumie, I need to reconsider my strategy," Jonathan said, his voice carrying just the right note of defeat. "Given the strength of the case presented yesterday, I believe I may need to consult with professional counsel after all." The whispers grew louder. Margaret Chen stood, unable to suppress a triumphant smile. "Your Honor, we object strenuously to this delay. Mr. Roumie has had months to prepare his defense. This appears to be a stalling tactic." Judge Thornwald studied Jonathan's face, searching for the game she sensed but couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Roumie," she said slowly, "are you telling this court that you're finally admitting you need a lawyer?" "I'm admitting that perhaps I underestimated the complexity of these proceedings," Jonathan replied, the words tasting like ash but necessary for the larger plan. "I want to ensure I'm providing the best possible defense." Victoria Hammond leaned forward, whispering urgently to Chen, who nodded with barely concealed satisfaction. Judge Thornwald tapped her fingers on the bench, considering. She wanted to deny the request. Jonathan could see it in her eyes. But her legal training wouldn't allow her to deny a defendant the opportunity to seek proper representation. "Very well," she said finally, though her tone suggested disappointment rather than approval. "We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9. But Mr. Roumie, this is your only continuance. If you're not prepared to proceed tomorrow, I'll consider it abandonment of your defense." "I understand, Your Honor," Jonathan said, sitting down with apparent relief. As the courtroom emptied, Chen approached Jonathan with barely professional courtesy, finally seeing sense. "Are we?" she asked. "If you'd like to discuss settlement terms, my office would be open to conversation." Jonathan met her gaze, careful to keep his expression neutral. "I appreciate the offer. Let me think about it." Outside, reporters swarmed with renewed energy. "Is this the beginning of the end? Has reality set in? Will you settle?" David pushed through, clearing a path, and they escaped to their car without comment. Once inside, David allowed himself a small smile. "That went perfectly." Chen looked ready to dance. "Victoria thinks it's over." Jonathan agreed, pulling out his phone. "Now we make sure Sarah is ready for tomorrow." They spent the afternoon in rehearsal mode, though not the kind Jonathan's acting background might suggest. Instead, he worked with Sarah on something more important than performance, on accessing and articulating truth with clarity and courage. They went through Chen's likely lines of attack, preparing not scripted responses but principles Sarah could anchor herself to when cross-examination became brutal. "Your employment contract had a confidentiality clause," Jonathan said, playing devil's advocate. "Chen will argue you're violating it by being here." "The contract has an exception for illegal activity," Sarah replied steadily. "Corporate espionage isn't protected by confidentiality agreements." She'll suggest you're a disgruntled employee seeking revenge for not being promoted. "I turned down 2 promotions to stay in content development," Sarah countered. "I resigned on principle, not ambition." They continued for hours, Jonathan pushing, Sarah finding her ground, until her testimony had the ring of unshakable truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could undermine. As evening approached, David ordered dinner, and they ate while reviewing the final piece of Jonathan's strategy, the obscure legal provision that would transform victory from moral to comprehensive, Section 34C of the Digital Content Protection Act. Jonathan explained to Sarah, allows courts to impose development bans when educational content theft is proven. 5 years where Streamfaith cannot create actor training programs. That would devastate their expansion plans, Sarah said. They've been telling investors that educational content is their future growth sector. Exactly. Jonathan nodded. Which is why they'll fight desperately once they realize what I'm actually asking for. But by then, the evidence will make that fight impossible. A knock on the door interrupted them. David opened it to find a courier with a thick envelope marked urgent. Jonathan opened it and scanned the contents. his expression darkening. It's from Chen's office. Settlement offer. $10 million if we drop the case and sign a confidentiality agreement. That's a fortune, David said quietly. That's the price of my silence. Jonathan corrected. He set the offer aside. Not interested. You're turning down $10 million. I'm turning down the chance to let theft go unpunished. Jonathan replied, Money can't fix what Victoria did. Only accountability can. Around midnight, Jonathan sat alone in the office, reviewing security footage one more time. He had watched these clips dozens of times, but repetition revealed new details. There, Victoria's assistant zooming in on the curriculum outline. There, Victoria herself taking a photo through the window. And there, the most damning moment, Victoria pausing to read the entire framework board, her lips moving as she memorized the structure Jonathan had spent 6 years developing. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief: tomorrow. Speak your truth. She will hear it. The message included no name. But Jonathan suspected it came from someone within the court system. Perhaps even someone close to Judge Thornwald, who understood what this case really represented. He responded with a simple thank you and returned to his preparations. The leather journal lay open before him, filled with notes that looked chaotic to anyone else but formed a perfectly ordered strategy in Jonathan's mind. Each seemingly random observation, each character analysis, each legal citation was precisely placed, waiting for tomorrow when they would all come together in a presentation that would transform the courtroom's understanding of everything that had happened. David found him at 2 a.m, still working. You need sleep, he said. Tomorrow is the most important day of your professional life. Jonathan looked up, and David was struck by the calm in his eyes. Tomorrow isn't about my professional life, he said quietly. It's about proving that authenticity defeats deception. That truth told clearly resonates more than lies told persuasively. And that sometimes the greatest act of faith is trusting the process when everyone thinks you're failing. Do you really believe Judge Thornwald will see what you want her to see? David asked. Jonathan closed his journal. I believe she's been waiting 30 years to see justice done in a case like hers. I believe watching Victoria Hammond's theft mirrors her own pain in ways that will make the evidence impossible to ignore. And I believe that when Sarah testifies tomorrow, when Victoria's own notebook is entered into evidence, when the timeline makes their lies undeniable, Judge Thornwald will finally get the vindication she never received for herself. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the sleeping city. The courthouse stood dark and silent across the street, waiting for tomorrow's drama. Chen thinks she's already won. Jonathan continued. Victoria thinks I'm preparing to surrender. Even Judge Thornwald expects me to show up with a new lawyer and a settlement proposal. None of them understand that everything up to now has been prologue, setting the stage for what comes next. Which is? Jonathan turned back, and his expression held the focused intensity that made his portrayal of Jesus so compelling. Tomorrow, I stop playing the confused amateur. Tomorrow, they see what I've actually been preparing for 6 months. Tomorrow, the trap closes. And everyone in that courtroom learns that sometimes the greatest performances happen when you stop performing and start revealing truth so clearly that even those determined to ignore it cannot look away. David felt a chill run down his spine. Not from fear, but from recognition. He had seen that look before, when Jonathan was about to film the most demanding scenes, when the character he portrayed was about to confront injustice with nothing but moral authority and unshakable conviction. Tomorrow would not be acting. Tomorrow would be Jonathan Roumie, bringing those same qualities into a realm where they mattered even more. Go home, Jonathan said gently. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we need to be sharp. After David left, Jonathan made one final review of the evidence. Sarah's testimony would establish the timeline and Victoria's direct orders. The security footage would prove theft occurred. The emails and documents would demonstrate systematic copying. And Victoria's notebook, that beautiful piece of self-incriminating evidence, would tie everything together in her own handwriting. But more than evidence, Jonathan had something Chen and her expensive legal team didn't understand. He had the ability to tell a story that resonated on emotional and moral levels, to present facts not as dry data but as narrative that revealed character and consequence. 6 years of embodying a figure known for speaking truth to power had taught him that how you present truth matters almost as much as the truth itself. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, Jonathan finally allowed himself to sleep for a few hours. His dreams were vivid, filled with courtrooms and confrontations, with Victoria's smug face crumbling as evidence mounted, with Judge Thornwald's expression transforming from contempt to recognition to something approaching vindication. When he woke, the clarity remained. Today would be difficult. Today would be brutal. But today would also be the day when everyone understood that Jonathan Roumie had never been lost, never been unprepared, never been the fumbling amateur they assumed. He had been waiting, watching, setting the stage for this exact moment when truth could be presented with maximum impact and deception would have nowhere left to hide. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Thornwald entered the next morning, her expression suggesting she expected to see Jonathan accompanied by expensive attorneys or perhaps preparing to settle. Instead, he sat alone at his table. But something fundamental had changed. The scattered papers were gone, replaced by organized folders. The confused demeanor had vanished, supplanted by focused calm. Even his posture was different, straight and purposeful where it had been slouched and uncertain. "Mr. Roumie," Judge Thornwald began, "have you retained counsel?" "No, Your Honor," Jonathan replied, his voice clear and steady. "I'm prepared to proceed with my defense." Margaret Chen shot Victoria Hammond a confused glance. This wasn't the defeated actor they had expected to face. Judge Thornwald frowned slightly, sensing the shift but not yet understanding its significance. "Very well," she said. "Present your case." Jonathan stood and approached the bench with none of yesterday's fumbling hesitation. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness, Sarah Martinez, former Director of Content Development at Stream Faith Media." The courtroom erupted in startled murmurs. Chen was on her feet instantly. "Objection, we received no notice of this witness. This is highly irregular." Judge Thornwald's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Roumie, you're required to provide witness lists in advance. Miss Martinez only came forward 2 days ago." "Your Honor," Jonathan explained calmly. After seeing Streamfaith's testimony, her conscience wouldn't allow their lies to stand unchallenged. Under Rule 26, I'm permitted to add witnesses when new information becomes available that's critical to justice. The judge considered this, clearly torn. Chen pressed her advantage. "Your Honor, this is obviously a stunt. A disgruntled former employee doesn't constitute new evidence. Let me hear the foundation for this testimony." Judge Thornwald decided, "Miss Martinez may take the stand, but I reserve the right to strike her testimony if it's not properly relevant." Sarah entered through the back doors, and Victoria Hammond's face went pale. She leaned toward Chen, whispering urgently, but the attorney could only shake her head helplessly. After being sworn in, Sarah settled into the witness chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "Miss Martinez," Jonathan began, "how long did you work for Streamfaith Media?" 7 years. Sarah replied. "I started as a junior content developer and rose to director level. Can you describe your role? I oversaw the creation of all educational and instructional content across StreamFaith's platforms. Jonathan nodded. Were you present at a meeting on April 3rd of last year? The day after CEO Victoria Hammond visited my production facility. Yes, Sarah said. Victoria called an emergency meeting of senior staff that afternoon. Judge Thornwald leaned forward, her skepticism beginning to shift to interest. Can you describe what happened at that meeting? Sarah took a steady breath. Victoria was extremely excited, almost manic. She had photos on her phone, dozens of them, showing detailed curriculum plans, module structures, and teaching methodologies. She projected them on the conference room screen and announced we were going to create an identical program. Objection. Chen called out. Hearsay and speculation about intent. The witness is testifying about what she directly observed and heard. Jonathan countered smoothly. That's not hearsay. Your Honor, it's direct testimony of statements made by the party opponent. Judge Thornwald nodded slowly, impressed despite herself by Jonathan's command of evidentiary rules. Overruled. Continue. Miss Martinez. Victoria's exact words were, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. This is what we're building. And we need it done before Roumie can patent his approach. She assigned me to lead the project with an 8-week deadline. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to pause, stunned by the testimony. Did you raise any objections? Jonathan asked. Yes. I told her it sounded like corporate espionage. I suggested we approach you about a legitimate partnership or develop our own distinct methodology. How did Miss Hammond respond? Sarah looked directly at Victoria, who refused to meet her eyes. She said, and these were her exact words, because I wrote them down immediately afterward. Why pay for what we can take for free? A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Judge Thornwald's expression had transformed completely. The condescension replaced by intense focus. Chen stood again, her composure finally cracking. Your Honor, this testimony is clearly fabricated. A disgruntled employee making accusations without evidence. Actually, Jonathan said calmly. Miss Martinez kept detailed contemporaneous notes. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence these documents. He handed a thick folder to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Judge Thornwald opened it and began reading, her eyes widening with each page. These are meeting minutes, she said slowly. Email exchanges, text message, transcripts, all documenting StreamFaith's directives to copy Mr. Roumie's work, all kept by Miss Martinez as part of her regular duties. Jonathan confirmed. She documented everything because she was uncomfortable with what she was being asked to do. Chen approached the bench. Your Honor, these documents contain proprietary StreamFaith information. Miss Martinez had no right to remove them from the company. Actually, Jonathan interjected, producing another document, StreamFaith's own employment contract, which I've included in the evidence folder, explicitly states that employees are both protected and obligated to report illegal activities. Miss Martinez was acting within her contractual rights and moral obligations. Judge Thornwald studied the contract, then nodded. The documents are admitted. She looked at Sarah with new respect. Miss Martinez, did StreamFaith have any similar educational program in development before Miss Hammond's visit to Mr. Roumie's facility? None whatsoever, Sarah stated firmly. We were focused entirely on devotional content and Bible study materials. The entire concept of actor training emerged only after Victoria returned from that visit. I have strategic planning documents from 2 weeks prior showing our development roadmap. Actor education wasn't even mentioned. Jonathan produced more evidence. Your Honor, I'd also like to enter security footage from Miss Hammond's visit to my facility. The courtroom screens lit up with crystal-clear video. There was Victoria's assistant photographing Jonathan's curriculum board when his back was turned. There was the other assistant zooming in on documents with her tablet. And there, most damning of all, was Victoria herself taking photos through the office window after being told that area was restricted. Her face clearly visible as she captured images of proprietary materials. Judge Thornwald watched the footage with an expression that suggested she was seeing her own past replayed before her. The theft she had experienced 30 years ago, now proven in vivid detail for someone else. When the video ended, she turned to Victoria with barely concealed contempt. Chen launched into cross-examination. But Sarah was unshakable. The attorney tried to portray her as vengeful, as unreliable, as motivated by spite. But every attack crumbled against the documentary evidence and Sarah's calm, consistent testimony. When Chen finally sat down, she looked defeated for the first time since the trial began. "Your Honor," Jonathan said, standing again. "I have one more piece of evidence. During discovery, we obtained Miss Hammond's personal notebook, the one she kept with her during business meetings." He held up a leather-bound journal remarkably similar to his own. Judge Thornwald extended her hand, and Jonathan passed it to her. "Turn to the entry dated April 3rd, he suggested. The day after the visit, Judge Thornwald found the page and began reading aloud, her voice growing harder with each word. "Saw Roumie's teaching method today. Revolutionary approach, combining acting technique with theological depth. 12-module structure is brilliant. Must fast-track our version. Assign Sarah's team to reverse engineer immediately. Get this to market before he can scale." The judge looked up at Victoria, who had gone completely pale. "This is your handwriting, Miss Hammond." Victoria's attorney tried to object, but Judge Thornwald cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Miss Hammond, is this your handwriting?" Victoria's voice was barely audible. "Yes. And these are your words. Written the day after you visited Mr. Roumie's facility." "Yes," Victoria whispered, realizing too late that her own documentation had become the most damning evidence against her. Judge Thornwald set the notebook down carefully, and when she looked at Jonathan, her expression had completely transformed. Gone was the mockery, the condescension, the dismissive amusement. In its place was something approaching awe and perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit who understood injustice intimately. "Mr. Roumie," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. When you first entered my courtroom, I made assumptions about your abilities and your preparedness. I was profoundly wrong." Jonathan nodded in acknowledgement but remained silent, allowing the moment to speak for itself. The judge turned to Victoria and Chen. "Does the plaintiff wish to present any response to this evidence?" Chen stood slowly, and, for the first time, she looked uncertain. "Your Honor, we request a recess to consult with our client." Judge Thornwald's expression hardened. "You had months to prepare your case. Miss Chen, Mr. Roumie deserves the same consideration you gave yourself. We'll proceed." As afternoon light slanted through the courtroom windows, Jonathan methodically dismantled every claim Streamfaith had made. He presented timeline evidence showing their program emerged only after Victoria's visit. He showed emails proving systematic copying. He demonstrated how Streamfaith had zero actor education expertise before suddenly claiming to have developed a revolutionary method. And through it all, Judge Thornwald watched with the intensity of someone witnessing not just a legal case but a personal vindication. Seeing the theft that had driven her to law school finally exposed and condemned in her own courtroom through another victim's courage and strategic brilliance. The fumbling actor she had mocked was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest performance wasn't pretending to be something you're not, but revealing truth so clearly that even those determined to deny it could no longer look away. As the afternoon session drew toward conclusion, Jonathan rose for his final presentation. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had saved the most important argument for last. "I'd like to address the remedy I'm seeking in this case." Judge Thornwald nodded, completely engaged. "Now, proceed." "Mr. Roumie, I'm not simply asking for Streamfaith's claims to be dismissed," Jonathan explained. "I'm invoking Section 34C of the Digital Content Protection Act of 2019. A puzzled expression crossed Chen's face. Judge Thornwald also looked uncertain, and Jonathan felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The provision states that when corporate espionage involving educational curriculum is proven, courts may prohibit the offending party from developing similar content for up to 5 years. The courtroom fell silent as the implications sank in. Chen was on her feet instantly. "Your Honor? I've never heard of this statute. This is absurd. It's relatively obscure," Jonathan acknowledged, handing documents to the clerk. The provision was added as an amendment during final passage. Few attorneys know it exists because it's rarely invoked. But it's absolutely applicable here. Judge Thornwald studied the statute carefully, her eyebrows rising. "He's correct," she said slowly. "This provision does exist and appears directly relevant to these facts." She looked at Jonathan with renewed amazement. "How did you find this?" "6 months of research, Your Honor," Jonathan replied simply. "When I decided to represent myself, I read everything. Every statute, every precedent, every obscure amendment that might apply. This provision was designed specifically to create meaningful consequences for exactly what Streamfaith did." Victoria Hammond had gone ashen. She leaned toward Chen, whispering frantically. But the attorney could only shake her head in stunned disbelief. "Your Honor," Chen said desperately, "such a remedy would be catastrophic for my client's business. A 5-year ban on educational content development would destroy their growth strategy. That should have been considered before engaging in corporate espionage." Judge Thornwald replied coolly, "The statute is clear. If corporate theft of educational curriculum is proven, this remedy is available." She turned to Jonathan with something approaching admiration. "Mr. Roumie, I must say your legal strategy has been remarkable. The way you appeared unprepared while systematically building an airtight case. It was masterful." Jonathan nodded in acknowledgement. "Sometimes, Your Honor, the best defense isn't what people expect." The judge allowed herself a small smile. "Indeed." She looked at Chen. "Does the plaintiff wish to present closing arguments?" Chen rose, but her earlier confidence had completely evaporated. "Your Honor," she began weakly, "while certain evidence appears problematic, we maintain that similarities between programs can occur independently." Her words sounded hollow even to her own ears, contradicted by mountains of evidence proving deliberate theft. When Chen sat down, Jonathan approached for his final statement. He didn't need notes now. The closing argument had been refined over months, waiting for this moment. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, his voice carrying the same authentic intensity he brought to his most demanding performances. "This case is about more than intellectual property. It's about the difference between creating and stealing, between earning success and taking it from others who did the work." He gestured toward the evidence, displays. Victoria Hammond didn't develop the sacred method through innovation or hard work. She walked into my facility, smiled while gaining my trust, secretly photographed my life's work, and then directed her team to copy it before I could protect it. Her own notebook proves this beyond any doubt. Jonathan paused, letting that truth settle. Stream Faith wants this court to believe their program was independently developed. But the timeline destroys that claim. They had no actor education program before Victoria's visit. None. Within 8 weeks afterward, they had a complete curriculum identical to mine in structure, approach, and even terminology. Judge Thornwald listened with complete focus, and Jonathan knew she was hearing echoes of her own story, finally being argued the way she had wished someone could have argued it for her 3 decades ago. The Digital Content Protection Act exists because our society recognizes that creativity has value. He continued, that those who build something meaningful deserve protection from those who would simply take it. Section 34C's 5-year development ban exists specifically for cases like this, where theft is so egregious that ordinary damages aren't sufficient. He looked directly at Victoria. I'm not asking for this remedy out of vengeance. I'm asking for it because without serious consequences, nothing changes. Stream Faith will continue identifying innovations others create, taking them through deception, and crushing anyone who can't afford to fight back legally. His voice dropped, becoming more personal. I could afford this fight, Your Honor. Most people can't. But if this court sends a message that corporate espionage carries real, meaningful consequences, perhaps the next creator won't have to stand where I'm standing, defending work that should never have been stolen in the first place. The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Thornwald sat motionless, her eyes fixed on Jonathan, and he could see tears threatening at their edges. She blinked them back, regaining her judicial composure. But something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just another case anymore. This was personal vindication. Justice finally served in a way she had been denied. The court will take a brief recess to consider the evidence and prepare a ruling, Judge Thornwald announced. Her voice was thick with emotion she was struggling to contain. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. In the hallway outside, reporters surrounded both parties. Victoria pushed through without comment, her face a mask of devastated fury. Chen followed, fielding questions with corporate deflection that convinced no one. Jonathan stood calmly as cameras clicked, answering honestly. Justice isn't about winning or losing. It's about truth being heard and honored. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Judge Thornwald entered, and something in her bearing suggested the decision had been difficult, not in substance, but in confronting what it meant personally. She settled into her chair and looked directly at Jonathan before beginning. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, she announced, her voice steady and clear, this court finds that Stream Faith Media engaged in deliberate, systematic, corporate espionage. The testimony of Sarah Martinez, corroborated by documentary evidence and video footage, establishes beyond doubt that CEO Victoria Hammond visited Mr. Roumie's facility under false pretenses, secretly obtained proprietary materials, and directed her team to copy his work. Victoria closed her eyes in defeat. Chen sat motionless, understanding that appeals would be futile against such overwhelming evidence. Therefore, Judge Thornwald continued, Stream Faith's copyright claims are dismissed with prejudice. Additionally, pursuant to Section 34C of the Digital Content Protection Act, Stream Faith Media is hereby prohibited from developing, marketing, or distributing actor education programs for a period of 5 years from today's date. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, Stream Faith shall pay damages of $15 million to Mr. Roumie for attempted fraud and harm to his business. All legal costs shall be borne by the plaintiff. She paused, then added with unmistakable steel in her voice. This court also refers this matter to the United States Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal charges related to corporate espionage and perjury committed during these proceedings. Victoria's face had gone completely white. The 5-year ban combined with criminal investigation would likely destroy her career and severely damage Streamfaith's market position. Judge Thornwald looked at her with cold satisfaction. "Miss Hammond, your actions represent everything wrong with corporate culture that values profit over integrity. This court hopes today's ruling sends a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated." Before adjourning, Judge Thornwald did something unprecedented. She addressed the courtroom directly. "I want to acknowledge something publicly. When Mr. Roumie first appeared before me, representing himself, I made assumptions about his competence and preparedness. I was dismissive, condescending, and wrong." She looked at Jonathan. "Mr. Roumie has demonstrated that innovative thinking applies to legal strategy as much as to any other field. His preparation and presentation have been exemplary, and I apologize for my initial attitude." The acknowledgement sent shockwaves through the legal community present. Judges rarely admitted error so publicly. Jonathan stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. Your fairness, once you saw the evidence, is what mattered most." Court is adjourned. Judge Thornwald said, striking her gavel for the final time in this case. Outside, the scene was chaotic. Victoria refused all comment. Hustled to a waiting car by security. Chen gave a terse statement about considering appeals, though her tone suggested she knew that fight was already lost. Jonathan stood on the courthouse steps as the sun set over Los Angeles, answering questions with grace and humility that only enhanced his victory. 2 months later, Judge Beatrice Thornwald announced her retirement after 30 years on the bench. The timing surprised many in the legal community who expected her to serve several more years. But those close to her understood. Something had shifted during the Roumie case. A sense of completion that made continuing feel unnecessary. The day after her retirement became official, Jonathan called her. There was a conversation that needed to happen. Truths that needed acknowledging. They met at a quiet restaurant in Pasadena, far from courthouse corridors and media attention. "I know why you invited me here," Beatrice said as they settled into a private booth. "You're going to offer me a position with your company." Jonathan smiled. "Am I that predictable? You're that strategic." She corrected. "You've been strategic from the beginning, including with me." He didn't deny it. "I researched your background thoroughly. Found articles about what happened to you in 1985, the teaching method that was stolen, how it drove you to law school." Beatrice nodded slowly. "So your entire courtroom strategy, the fumbling performance, the carefully timed revelation, it was all designed to appeal to my personal history, to help you see yourself in my situation." Jonathan confirmed. "To show you that theft 30 years ago finally being answered with justice now, even if it wasn't your case getting resolved. That's manipulation," she said, though her tone held more curiosity than accusation. "It's understanding your audience." Jonathan replied, "I needed a judge who wouldn't just follow law mechanically, but who would see the human cost of what Victoria did. Your experience made you the perfect judge for this case. But only if I could help you see the parallels." Beatrice sat back, processing this revelation. "I should be angry that you played me, but you're not." Jonathan observed. "No," she admitted, "because everything you presented was true. The evidence was real. The theft was proven. The law was applicable. You didn't manipulate facts. You just presented them in a way that resonated with my deepest convictions about justice." Jonathan pulled out a folder containing a formal offer. "I need someone who understands both creativity and law. Someone who can help protect innovations while navigating complex legal landscapes. Someone who lived through theft and spent decades making sure others didn't suffer the same way. Beatrice read the offer carefully. This is generous. Why me specifically? Because you don't just know law. He said. You understand why it matters. You've spent 30 years protecting people's creative work from those who would steal it. Now I'm asking you to do that from inside a company that's building something meaningful. She looked out the window at the mountains rising beyond the city. I spent 3 decades adjudicating from the bench. This would be very different. Different doesn't mean wrong. Jonathan replied, You're not retiring because you're done fighting for justice. You're retiring because the bench isn't the right venue anymore. Join me. Help build systems that prevent the theft you experienced and I experienced. Make sure the next creative person doesn't have to fight what we fought. Beatrice was silent for a long moment, then smiled. When do I start? 3 weeks later. Jonathan stood in his production facility with David, reviewing plans for the Chosen Methods expansion. Now that StreamFaith was legally barred from competition, the program could grow without threat of corporate predation. Enrollment had exploded following news coverage of the trial. With thousands of actors seeking the authentic training the court battle had validated. Beatrice Thornwald entered the facility wearing casual clothes instead of judicial robes. Ready to begin her new role, protecting creators rather than simply ruling on their disputes. As she toured the spaces where innovation happened, Jonathan felt deep satisfaction. Justice hadn't just been served in a courtroom. It had been transformed into ongoing protection for those who dared to create rather than steal. Somewhere across town, Victoria Hammond cleaned out her office at StreamFaith. The board had forced her resignation within days of the verdict. Criminal investigations proceeded, though she would likely avoid prison through cooperation and restitution. But her reputation was destroyed. Her career finished. Her pattern of theft finally exposed in ways that would follow her forever. The story spread throughout the entertainment industry, becoming a cautionary tale about the consequences of corporate espionage and the power of strategic thinking combined with authentic truth. Jonathan Roumie had proven that you didn't need the biggest legal team or the most money to win. You needed evidence, strategy, and the courage to fight for what mattered, regardless of how foolish others thought you looked along the way. As filming resumed on the next season of The Chosen, Jonathan reflected on what the trial had taught him. Playing a character known for challenging injustice had prepared him to do it in reality. The same principles that made his performances powerful: authenticity, truth, moral clarity, worked equally well in a courtroom when combined with meticulous preparation and strategic thinking. And perhaps most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the greatest act of faith wasn't performing miracles, but trusting that truth presented clearly and courageously would ultimately prevail over deception. No matter how well-funded or professionally packaged that deception might be. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.